I stood on the porch of my childhood home, the scent of jasmine still clinging faintly to the old lattice where it had bloomed every spring. The paint on the railing was peeling, the screen door still creaked, and the wind chime Linda hung when I was 10 sang the same hollow, brittle tune. I hadn't walked through that threshold in years, not since college, not since the hospital, not since the girl I once was, starving, brittle, and unseen, died quietly beneath the white sheets of an eating disorder unit. But here I was again, older, educated, licensed, and with a plan. My name is Adrian, and I am a clinical nutritionist. I am also Linda's stepdaughter, though no one says that out loud anymore. They say caregiver. They say devoted. They say medical proxy. Words that taste sterile compared to the history buried beneath this roof. Dad's work had taken him overseas again. Singapore, Hong Kong, London. He traveled more now that Linda was ill, or perhaps because she was ill. He couldn't face it. Couldn't face her. So he left me in charge, his dutiful daughter with a degree and the calm voice, the one who survived Linda's meticulous brand of love. She'd been losing weight rapidly, he said. Her diabetes was out of control, her behavior erratic. The doctors said she wasn't eating properly, and the caregivers they hired kept quitting. She trusts you, Dad had said. You're the only one she listens to. I didn't correct him. Linda didn't trust me. She feared me, and rightly so. As I walked inside, the memories clung to the walls like mildew. The kitchen table where I'd counted green beans. The bathroom scale that dictated whether I could have toast. The mirror where I'd stood, ribs poking through my skin, repeating her mantras. Vanity is unbecoming. Discipline builds character. Hunger is just healing. In disguise. All said with a loving hand on my shoulder and eyes that saw only a project to perfect. I moved her pill organizer from the counter and replaced it with a color-coded chart I'd made. Breakfast, 100 calories. Lunch, 200. Dinner, 300. Liquids, supplements, exercise log. All neatly arranged, all documented. This is what's best for you, I told her. She watched me from her armchair, thinner than I'd remembered, eyes sunken but sharp. You always did like your charts, she said with a brittle smile. You taught me well, I replied, setting down her dinner. Poached chicken breast, no seasoning, and steamed zucchini. No butter, no salt. Exactly 290 calories. She lifted her fork, hesitated. This is less than what the last nurse gave me. You've been eating too much, I said gently. That's why your blood sugar's a mess. I'm here to help you now. The first morning back in my childhood home began like a haunting echo of my past. The sun filtered through the kitchen windows, casting the same golden glow I remembered from early mornings when I would sit at the breakfast table, empty plate in front of me, stomach already growling, while Linda meticulously counted out 5 almonds or 3 apple slices, never both. Now, I was the one standing in the kitchen, preparing breakfast, the measured portion of egg whites and dry toast placed on the plate with surgical precision. Linda sat quietly, too weak to protest. I watched her fork tremble as she lifted the food to her mouth, and for a fleeting second, I felt the smallest twitch of guilt. But it was quickly buried beneath years of discipline, deprivation, and the memory of my own hands trembling the same way as hers, once upon a time. We need to monitor your sodium levels more carefully, I told her clinically. Too much fluid retention lately. You know how that affects your heart. She nodded obediently, and I made a note in the logbook, an invention of mine, a daily ritual that recorded her weight, her intake, her mood. She used to have one for me too. The irony wasn't lost on either of us. As the days passed, Linda's resistance began to falter. Her complaints were quiet, more often muttered than spoken aloud, and every attempt to deviate from the plan, an extra cracker, an unscheduled glass of juice, was documented as non-compliant behavior. I began leaving reminders in her path, faded copies of medical literature on geriatric nutrition, articles about the risks of overfeeding diabetic patients, and even a pamphlet titled, When Loved Ones Sabotage Their Health. The same psychological game she once played on me, now finely tuned with adult intelligence and clinical legitimacy. Every mealtime became a test, every reaction a data point. When she began to cry one evening after dinner, her tears silent and slow as they rolled down her cheeks, I pretended not to see. I washed the dishes while she stared blankly at the kitchen wall, her frail body curled in the same chair where she used to watch me eat in carefully rationed silence. The bridge club called to ask about her again. "Linda's missed 3 meetings," her friend Jeanette said over the phone. "Is everything all right?" I softened my voice, added just enough concern. "She's been very tired, more irritable than usual. Blood sugar fluctuations, the doctor thinks." I knew the words would stick, especially because Linda had used them to describe me once, years ago. The call stopped after that. Another thread snipped. Her world, once vibrant and social, was beginning to shrink to the confines of the house. And me. I kept her busy with health routines, yoga poses modified for her stiffness, journaling prompts that steered her into confronting her choices, and weigh-ins that had become more ritualistic than necessary. When I pinched her skin to check hydration levels, I lingered a beat too long. "Poor elasticity," I'd murmur, the same way she used to criticize my baby fat. Each bruise she collected was noted as a medical concern. Each complaint logged as a symptom. There was nothing she could say that wouldn't sound like confusion, or worse, delusion. One morning I found her in the hallway mirror, counting the ridges of her ribcage with quiet horror, and I was transported back to that same hallway, age 13, doing the same thing. Back then, she'd stood behind me and hissed, "Vanity is unbecoming. Focus on your health." Now I echoed it back to her with the serene authority of a professional. "You need to focus on healing, not appearance," I said gently, leading her back to her room. I knew then that the cracks were widening. She didn't see me as a daughter anymore. She saw me as a warden, a clinician, maybe even a stranger. That's how she used to describe herself when justifying her cruelty. "I'm not your friend. I'm your mother." It's different. That afternoon, I offered her a choice. "Admit what you did," I said simply. "Say it. Starving a child isn't parenting. It's abuse." Her eyes, still defiant, didn't blink. "It was discipline," she said flatly. "You were out of control. I taught you self-restraint." I exhaled and nodded slowly. "Then this is for your good, too." I reduced her dinner by 50 calories. The next day, I presented an adjusted diet plan to Dr. Patterson, our overseeing physician. With careful manipulations, exaggerated charts, and a fabricated report on Linda's activity levels, I secured approval to cut her intake to 900 calories. "She's essentially sedentary," I explained, "and her metabolism has slowed significantly." He didn't question it. Why would he? I was the trained nutritionist, the caring daughter, the expert. Linda's body began shrinking faster after that. She moved slower, needed help with stairs. She no longer challenged the food I served. Her silence wasn't submission, it was fear. But still, she wouldn't admit what she'd done. Not even when she found my old hospital records one afternoon, the folder left intentionally accessible while I prepared her.
Bland Lunds.
She read them slowly, eyes flicking across words like refeeding syndrome, organ atrophy, and critical malnutrition. I watched her as she looked up, voice trembling. "You almost died." "I did die," I said, placing her small plate in front of her. "That girl you raised died in that hospital bed." I gestured to myself, this is what grew back. That night, I mentioned Dad's travel schedule at dinner, casually dropping phrases about his Singapore project and the London quarterly reviews. Understanding dawned in Linda's eyes. "You've been making sure he stays gone," she said quietly. "You're isolating me."
No, y correcta.
"You isolated me. I just learned the system." She tried to speak, but the words wouldn't come. Her fingers curled around the edges of her napkin, trembling. The student had surpassed the teacher. But the lesson wasn't over yet. By the 3rd week, hunger had become a character in the house, palpable, persistent, whispering from the corners like an old ghost. It clung to Linda, hollowing out her cheeks, thinning her voice, softening her defiance. She no longer argued over portions or asked for more. She simply stared at the plate in front of her, eyes dull, hands moving with mechanical obedience. I watched her disintegrate with a precision that would have impressed any clinical trial director, each gram of weight loss a vindication, each dizzy stumble a silent scream of confession she refused to verbalize. The old argument, that she'd discipline me for my own good, still lingered in the air like stale perfume, but it no longer masked the stench of cruelty. I made it a point to rotate her meals through the same cleansing regimen she once imposed on me. Black coffee in the morning, you don't need sugar, it's just a habit. Bone broth for lunch, healing starts when digestion rests, and dry steamed vegetables for dinner. If she asked about calories, I quoted the same pseudo-medical mantras she'd fed me as a child. Hunger is healing, I would whisper, offering a cold cup of chamomile tea instead of dessert. And when she pleaded, quietly and only when she thought I wasn't listening, I simply logged it as food-seeking behavior. I planted small indulgences, candy bars, crackers, old chocolates from the pantry, in her drawers, in her nightstand, in her purse. Not for comfort, but for proof. Each time she gave in, I documented it. Snapped pictures. Jotted notes.
Non compliant.
Obsessive tendencies. Sugar dependency relapse. I brought those notes to her doctor, who began to trust my assessments more than Linda's own words. She's still sneaking food. I'd sigh. It's heartbreaking. But if we don't stick to the plan, we'll lose her. And so, the plan continued. Eleanor, my half-sister, Linda's golden child, wasn't hard to sway. All it took was a few carefully shared updates, some emotionally loaded concerns, and Eleanor was doubting her mother's mental clarity. You think she's developing dementia? She asked during one of our weekly calls. There are signs, I replied cautiously. Mood swings. Inconsistent memory.
Odd eating behaviors.
And you remember how controlling she used to be with food. Eleanor did remember, though not clearly, just enough for my version to fill in the gaps. When she confronted Linda, the exchange didn't go well. You've always been obsessive, Eleanor snapped. Even when we were little. Maybe this is karma. I pretended to be concerned when Linda told me later, face blotched from tears. She thinks I deserve this, she whispered. Do you? I asked, not unkindly. It was around then that I began using her own starvation methods with the sort of professionalism only someone who had survived them could achieve. I reminded her of the benefits of fasting, of resetting the gut, of shrinking her appetite. Every word was a reflection. Every phrase one she had used on me in a different decade, with a different motive. But now, the motives had converged. Now I was healing her through hunger, just as she claimed to have healed me. The garage sale was a stroke of luck. Linda wandered out, weak and pale, and ended up at the neighbor's bake sale table, fumbling through her wallet, desperate for food. Just one cookie, she begged. Please, I have money. I arrived just in time to intervene, drawing sympathetic glances from onlookers. She has a sugar addiction, I explained softly. She doesn't always remember that cookies could literally kill her. It's part of her condition. The neighbors nodded solemnly. One woman put a comforting hand on my shoulder. You're doing the Lord's work, she said. I thanked her, lowering my gaze in humble gratitude while Linda sat trembling in a folding chair nearby, too weak to argue, too ashamed to cry. At home, she tried to confront me. You set me up, she said. You're poisoning everyone against me. I didn't deny it. I documented your choices, I said calmly. You taught me that discipline is love, and that tough love saves lives. I'm saving yours. I found her that night with her face buried in a pantry shelf, crumbs on her lips, her hands trembling around a half-eaten protein bar. You don't want to heal, I said, logging the incident in my report. You want to indulge. When Catherine, our family's occasional voice of reason, began to question the weight loss, I responded with medical gravitas. Diabetes is unforgiving, I said. It's either control or catastrophe. I showed her a spreadsheet of blood sugar levels and foot amputation statistics. It was enough. She backed off, trusting my credentials, my care, my concern. But the real weapon wasn't the data. It was the authority I now wielded, the expertise Linda had ironically pushed me to develop, the very skill set that allowed me to destroy her in ways even she couldn't have imagined. I anticipated every move. When Linda tried to convince the family she was being mistreated, I had meal logs and photos. When she called Eleanor, crying about starvation, I reminded Eleanor that she'd eaten a full lunch just hours earlier. "It's so sad," I murmured. "She's getting confused again." The evidence always aligned with my narrative. Her contradictions, her desperation, they only proved my point. The final blow came at the grocery store. I found her in the bread aisle, clutching a loaf like a drowning woman. "I need food," she sobbed, drawing stairs. "She's starving me." I stepped forward, placing a calming hand on her shoulder. "We talked about this," I said softly. "You know what carbs do to your blood sugar." The store manager came over, confused. "She's diabetic," I explained. "This happens sometimes." Food confusion. Aggression. It's tragic, but manageable. Linda slumped in my arms, defeated. I led her home, as sympathetic shoppers whispered prayers behind us. By then, I had turned her into a cautionary tale, a tragic case of food addiction, a woman so sick she couldn't even recognize help when it was right in front of her. But behind that glassy stare, she knew. And I knew she knew. Linda's collapse came quietly, almost as if her body finally accepted the inevitable surrender. It was a Thursday morning. The sun filtered weakly through the kitchen blinds, casting pale stripes across the floor as she crumpled, her frail frame folding in on itself like a marionette with its strings cut. I found her lying there, breath shallow, face ashen, hands twitching as if trying to grasp at air. I felt no panic, only the cold efficiency that had guided me for months. I called 911 with a voice so steady that the operator praised my composure. "She's diabetic," I explained. "Non-compliant with her diet. Blood sugars probably dangerously low." When the paramedics arrived, I handed over my meticulously prepared charts, meal logs, notes on her supposed cheating, records of her confusion and agitation. The EMTs nodded grimly, lifting her onto the stretcher as I trailed behind. The portrait of a devoted caregiver at the end of a rope. At the hospital, I became the liaison between Linda and the world. I spoke to the doctors in measured tones, showing them the data I'd fabricated. Falsified food diaries that made her look like she'd been sneaking snacks at every opportunity, staged photos of wrappers I'd planted in her room, glucose readings skewed by the sugar I'd added to her permitted foods. "She must be hiding food somewhere," I said, my brow furrowed with concern. "I've tried everything, but she's determined to sabotage her health." The medical team saw what I wanted them to see, a patient too addicted to food to follow even the most basic care plan. They admitted her to stabilize her blood sugar, but the hospital nutritionist raised an eyebrow at my meal plans. 900 calories a day? She asked, flipping through the documents. "That's extremely low." I was ready. "I thought so, too," I said earnestly. "But look at this." She logs double portions, eats in secret. I had to restrict intake just to counter the hidden calories. I watched as doubt flickered and then died in the nutritionist's eyes, smothered by the weight of my evidence. Linda's voice, weak, trembling, tried to cut through the web I'd spun. "Please," she rasped, "I'm not lying. She's doing this to me." But the doctors only shook their heads, with sympathetic resignation. "Denial is common in cases like this," one said. Dad flew back from Singapore that night, clutching a folder I recognized immediately. My old medical records. He'd found them hidden in Linda's closet, where she'd stored them years ago, perhaps out of guilt, perhaps out of fear. I watched his hands tremble as he read the words that cataloged my slow starvation, the damage done to my bones, my growth, my fertility. "She almost died," he whispered, his face pale. He turned to Linda, who lay silent in her hospital bed, too weak to speak. "Did you do this?" he asked her, voice breaking. "Did you starve my daughter?" Before she could answer, I spoke softly, placing a hand on his arm. "Dad, she's sick. She needs care, not blame." But he saw through me. For the first time, he saw me. Did you do to her what she did to you? He asked, horror dawning in his eyes. I didn't deny it. I didn't need to. The family gathered the next morning for what Eleanor insisted would be a reckoning. Around the dining room table, we faced each other like combatants, the ghosts of every mealtime battle hanging heavy in the air. I laid out my evidence. The diet journals Linda had kept of my childhood, the stolen lunch money receipts, the notes she'd made about my weight, my calories, my failures. This is what she did, I said. Eleanor's face went pale as she read the words, seeing for the first time the clinical coldness with which Linda had monitored my starvation. But then Catherine spoke, her voice quiet but firm. And what about what you did? She produced photos, ones I thought I'd hidden, ones that showed Linda's weight loss timeline didn't match my claims. The cracks in my narrative widened. Eleanor, torn between loyalty and truth, whispered, "You became her." Before I could answer, Emma gasped, clutching her throat, her face flushing red. The pastries I'd offered had contained hidden peanuts. Chaos erupted. As Eleanor ran for the EpiPen, as I called 911, as Linda struggled from her chair to help despite her frailty, I saw in that moment what I had become, a reflection, a distortion, a monster shaped by a monster. The hospital stay that followed exposed everything. The doctors noted the precision of Linda's malnutrition, too exact to be accidental. Dad confronted me in the cafeteria, staring at the untouched tray of food in front of me. "You became what you chose," he said quietly, "not what she made." And with that, he severed ties, divorcing Linda, cutting me out of his life, refusing to let the poison we'd both spread touch his new family. Eleanor banned us both from seeing Emma. Catherine filed formal complaints. Linda entered a nursing home, too weak to live alone, and I returned to my practice, a healer tainted by the methods I'd mastered in the name of justice. Silence has a taste. The house felt cavernous after everything. Linda gone, Dad vanished from my life, and the silence inside those walls rang louder than any argument ever had. I returned to work wearing my most polished mask, compassionate, composed, clinical. The waiting room filled again with new patients seeking salvation through nutrition, unaware they were guided by someone who had once weaponized food with scalpel-like precision. I told myself I was helping them, that each meal plan I wrote now was penance for the damage I'd done, each success story a step toward redemption. But late at night, when the lights were off and the only sound was the refrigerator's quiet hum, I would find myself counting calories, grams, minutes, sins. Silence has a taste, and it tastes like old fear and forgotten hunger. Linda's condition stabilized, but she would never recover entirely. The damage was irreversible, the same way mine had once been. The irony didn't escape me. We had both been broken by starvation, hers inflicted recently, mine years ago. Now we shared a strange kind of twinhood, our fates bound together in a macabre echo of care and cruelty. I monitored her from a distance, even after I was legally barred from her facility. At first, through volunteers I sent bearing care packages, protein bars with doctored labels, sugar-free chocolates containing unlisted laxatives, tiny insults disguised as affection. I told myself I was ensuring she remembered. But when Catherine discovered the tampering and filed a final restraining order, even that tether snapped. The last note I received from Linda, delivered anonymously by a retired nurse who didn't know the full story, was a single sentence written in trembling, fragile script. "I finally understand." Understand what, I wondered? That hunger can hollow you into something unrecognizable? That discipline and abuse are not the same thing? Or perhaps that cruelty, once taught, can take on a life of its own, passed down like an heirloom? It didn't matter. There was nothing left to rebuild. The rest of the family had scattered, Eleanor refusing all contact, Catherine relocating to another state, and Emma growing up in a world where I was only a cautionary tale whispered behind closed doors. I moved cities not long after, starting over professionally under the guise of a research project on trauma-related eating disorders. The academic world welcomed me with open arms, credentials still intact, reputation technically untarnished. No one saw the cracks beneath my veneer, and I became an expert on recovery while hiding that I was still deep inside a different kind of sickness. I lectured on the psychological roots of control, the insidious ways disordered eating manifests, all while skipping meals out of habit and measuring my own hunger like it was a math equation. My body had become fluent in deprivation. I didn't trust fullness. It reminded me too much of weakness. I kept tabs on Dad, through mutual acquaintances. He remarried within a year, this time to a widow with a teenaged daughter. They posted family photos online, smiling at brunch, vacationing at the lake, celebrating birthdays with cakes Linda would have never allowed. The new stepdaughter was thin. I noticed that first. Too thin, perhaps, but maybe that was just genetics. Or maybe not. I watched the mother's Instagram posts, her comments about clean eating, about watching junk intake, about how proud she was of her daughter's discipline. I almost intervened. Almost sent a message.
But something stopped me.
Maybe fear. Maybe fatigue. Maybe I just didn't believe I had the right anymore. I began seeing patients one-on-one again, teens mostly, fragile and wide-eyed, walking the knife edge between health and obsession. I recognized the signs instantly, the same ones Linda had once ignored in me. The rigid posture, the obsession with numbers, the way they flinched when asked to describe their meals. I was good at breaking down their defenses because I'd worn them all myself. I could reach them, help them, guide them back from the brink. And yet, every time one recovered, gained weight, smiled at their reflection for the first time, I felt a pang of something dark. Was it envy? Or shame? Or a reminder that I never truly came back from the edge, just learned to decorate it with professional language? 5 years passed. The news from the nursing home was sparse. Linda's mobility decreased. Her memory faded. Her voice grew weaker. Eventually, she was moved into full-time assisted care. She no longer spoke clearly, but they said she never ate without glancing over her shoulder, as if I might be watching, as if I might take the plate away. I wasn't, of course. Not anymore. But the lesson had taken root. She knew now what it meant to live in fear of food, to beg for nourishment, to lose trust in your own body's needs. She knew because I made her know. Sometimes I would sit alone at night and think about the little girl I once was, curled on the floor of my bedroom, stomach cramping, counting the minutes until breakfast. I'd try to tell her that she'd survive, that someday she'd be the one in control. But the truth is, she didn't survive.
Not fully.
She became me. And I became the woman who made sure no one else would take her power again, even if it meant destroying someone to do it. Even if it meant becoming the villain. And Linda lives on, her days measured in bland, portioned meals and plastic trays.
She's not hated there.
She's just another elderly patient with complicated needs. But I know, even if she forgets everything else, she remembers how it felt to hunger and not be believed. That was the only apology I ever needed from her. Not words, not guilt, but the experience itself. She lived it. That's enough. The cycle didn't end with us. That's the truth I live with now. Abuse doesn't vanish when the victim becomes the caregiver. It mutates, embeds itself in the bloodstream of a family, festering until someone either chooses to amputate or continues the infection. I chose revenge dressed up as justice. Others chose silence. In the end, neither was clean. Neither was healing. It was Emma's voice I heard in my dreams the most, small, panicked, gasping for air as her throat closed from the hidden peanut oil in a cookie. I hadn't baked it myself, hadn't deliberately planted the danger, but I had known the kitchen wasn't safe. I'd seen the ingredients, seen the warning signs on the labels, and in my obsessive preoccupation with Linda's downfall, I had let a child nearly die. That truth lodged itself deeper than any calorie count or spreadsheet ever could. It was the moment I could no longer lie to myself. I hadn't just been seeking justice. I'd been playing God with hunger, pain, guilt, a mirror image of Linda in every terrible way. And worse still, I had dragged a new generation into the game. The family's dissolution had happened in layers. Eleanor's final words to me weren't shouted, weren't even dramatic. They were soft and surgical. You don't get to be near my daughter again. Catherine's farewell was quieter still. She simply stopped replying to my messages. Our parents' house, the one that had been filled with laughter, music, and controlled meal portions, was eventually sold. Dad moved with his new wife and stepdaughter to a coastal city, and I never visited. I couldn't bear to see another child eating under the supervision of a woman who believed in structure more than nourishment. I couldn't bear the possibility that I would recognize myself in her, or worse, in the girl. I threw myself into my work. I published papers on refeeding syndrome, on the long-term psychological effects of adolescent malnutrition, on the sociocultural pathology of inherited disordered eating. My lectures became standing room only, filled with med students, therapists, nutritionists, all hungry for answers I only pretended to possess. I spoke with passion and poise, shared case studies that mirrored my own history, and watched the audience scribble notes, unaware they were learning from someone who had been both patient and predator. In private, I binged on silence, skipped meals without noticing, and weighed myself compulsively, pretending it was research. I was no longer healing. I was curating the illusion of it. Occasionally, I saw Linda in my dreams, not the frail woman in the nursing home, but the imposing figure of my childhood, looming in the kitchen doorway with a measuring cup in one hand and judgment in the other. In those dreams, she was always counting. My bites, my worth, her own control. I woke with my heart pounding and my hands gripping the sheets, tasting vinegar and shame. Those dreams faded with time but were replaced by something worse. The dreams where I stood in her place, watching a terrified child try to hide a snack, and realizing I'd become the one doing the counting. A news story broke one summer, another case of Munchausen by proxy, a mother accused of falsifying her child's illness for attention. The child had been subjected to countless unnecessary medical procedures. I watched the coverage unfold, the pundits dissecting the mother's psychology.
Control, they said.
Projection. Unresolved trauma. As I listened, I found myself defending the mother in my mind, not out of agreement, but out of recognition. I understood the temptation. The seductive logic of rewriting one's past through the body of someone more vulnerable. I turned off the television and threw up. I began therapy again. Not the performative kind I'd dabbled in before, but something rawer, more honest. I found a trauma specialist outside the city, someone without connections to my professional network. Her office was unadorned, her questions surgical. She didn't flinch when I described what I had done. She didn't offer easy forgiveness or false comfort. "You were hurt," she said once. "But that doesn't justify hurting someone else." It wasn't revolutionary, but it was the first time I heard it spoken plainly. That sentence became my anchor. Every time I caught myself justifying, excusing, intellectualizing, I repeated it like a prayer. 3 years into therapy, I stopped sending packages to the nursing home. I stopped checking Linda's chart through backdoor channels. I deleted the folders labeled compliance logs and incident reports that I'd kept on my private drive like trophies. The grief came in waves. Not just for what I had done, but for the child I'd once been. For the girl who thought starvation was love. For the teenager who weighed self-worth in ounces and spoonfuls. For the woman I'd become in her name. One day, I received a letter, real paper, real ink. The handwriting was shaky. It wasn't signed, but I recognized the loops of the R and the tight, meticulous slant. "I forgive you," it said. No return address. No explanation. Just that. I stared at it for hours, unsure whether it was manipulation, closure, or both. I never responded. Some stories don't get endings. Just echoes. I shifted my work to prevention. Started a nonprofit focused on educating parents about early warning signs of disordered eating. I met with school counselors, pediatricians, guardians. I told them the same truth again and again. Hunger is never just about food. Control is never just about rules. And what we learn in childhood about our bodies, our worth, our place in a family can grow into monsters if we're not careful. Sometimes I'm invited to speak at panels, conferences, interviews. They ask about my inspiration. My why. I always pause. I think about Linda's empty plate. About Emma's gasps. about the tight ache in my stomach when I remember my 9th birthday. Dinner, dry chicken, 1 tablespoon of peas, and a candle with no cake. I tell them, I knew what it was like to be hungry. I didn't want anyone else to feel that way. And that's the truth. Just not the whole truth. Because part of me still measures everything. Not just food, but moments.
Regrets.
Tiny victories. I still find myself watching children at restaurants, noting whether they clean their plate, whether their parents scold or praise them. I still flinch when someone says you've lost weight as a compliment. I still struggle to eat without justification. That's the part of recovery no one glamorizes, the part where survival becomes a full-time job. Linda's still alive, last I heard. Nonverbal now, confined to a wheelchair, her meals fed to her by staff with little context. I wonder if she recognizes the irony. I wonder if she remembers me at 9, chewing slowly while she timed each bite. Probably not. But it doesn't matter anymore. I remember. I carry it all. And sometimes, in the quiet of a late night when I forget to eat and the old hunger claws its way back, I whisper to the memory of that little girl, "You didn't deserve this. You never did." The house I bought sat on a quiet street, far from where I grew up, with neighbors who didn't know my name and wouldn't ask. It was sterile at first, white walls, minimal furniture, spotless kitchen, but slowly, almost against my will, it became a home. I filled the shelves with books on nutrition and psychology, decorated the walls with framed quotes about healing, and stocked the kitchen with ingredients I barely touched. There was always food in the house, and yet I often forgot to eat. It wasn't punishment anymore, just habit. One too deeply embedded in muscle memory and ritual to shed easily. I tried. God, I tried. Therapy helped.
So, did distance.
But no amount of either could erase the instinct that had been honed for decades. I still woke at 5 a.m., heart racing, certain I'd missed a weigh-in. I still organized. My pantry alphabetically, color-coded my spices, and labeled leftovers with calorie counts. It wasn't about control anymore. It was about familiarity. Like a language I'd learned before I even knew I was speaking. Once a month, I attended a local support group, not for disordered eating but for adult survivors of childhood abuse. I never told them the whole truth. Just fragments. I was hungry a lot. She controlled everything I ate. Sometimes I still hear her voice when I try to cook. Others shared their own ghosts, belts, fists, silence. We cried in quiet solidarity. I never spoke of Linda by name. She was just my stepmother, a title that felt both clinical and deeply personal. It was at one of these meetings that I met James. He was tall, quiet, with the tired eyes of someone who had survived something unspeakable. We didn't talk much at first, just nods, small smiles. Over time, we began arriving early, staying late, talking about things that mattered and things that didn't. He had been raised by a mother who locked the fridge, who told him real men don't eat dessert, who pinched the skin on his arms and called it tough love. I understood. So when he invited me for coffee, I said yes. Our relationship was slow, careful, like people who had both been burned learning to approach fire again. We never pressured each other to talk, but we always listened. He didn't flinch when I described my calorie journals. I didn't judge when he admitted he still skipped meals to feel worthy. We were broken in compatible ways. That kind of intimacy doesn't come easy, but when it does, it's sacred. One night, over dinner, he asked the question no one else dared to ask. If she apologized, really apologized, would it change anything? I sat with the question like a stone in my throat. Linda's note, that "I forgive you" one, still sat in a drawer, yellowing with time. She hadn't asked for forgiveness. She hadn't admitted fault. But what if she had? What if she'd fallen to her knees and begged, wept, confessed? I didn't know. The truth was, I didn't want her apology. I wanted her to understand, to feel it in her bones. The emptiness,
The shame.
the endless counting. And part of me knew she never truly had. James understood that too. He squeezed my hand and said, "Sometimes we don't need their apologies. We just need to know we're not them." And that stayed with me. I began writing a memoir. Not for publication, not at first, but just to make sense of it all. I wrote about the green beans, the weigh-ins, the birthday without cake. I wrote about the hospital, the refeeding, the bone scans. I wrote about becoming Linda, and then trying not to be. Each page felt like lancing a wound. Painful, but necessary. I cried more during that year than I had in the decade before. Then one day, I got an email. Subject line: Speaking engagement inquiry. The sender was a young woman, a graduate student who had read one of my journal articles. She wanted me to speak at a campus event on the intersection of nutrition and trauma. She said my work had changed the way she viewed her clients, and that she hoped I'd share more of my story. I almost deleted it. Almost. But then I thought of the other women in my support group, of James, of Emma, of myself at 9, confused and hungry and scared. And I said yes. The night of the event, I stood in front of a packed auditorium, lights hot on my skin, hands trembling. I told the truth. Not all of it, but more than I ever had before. I spoke of a childhood where food was a weapon, of a woman who tried to rewrite her past through control, and of the danger of mistaking revenge for justice. I saw tears in the audience. Saw students leaning forward, taking notes, nodding. Afterward, a girl approached me, barely 20. She looked like I had once, small, anxious, hollow-eyed. "You told my story," she whispered. "You made me feel less crazy." That night, I opened a new document. I titled it Breaking the Pattern. It would become my second book. One that didn't just analyze trauma, but confronted it. One that admitted failure. One that asked for something I'd never been brave enough to seek: redemption. Linda died quietly 2 winters later. Pneumonia, compounded by decades of nutritional neglect. I didn't attend the funeral.
Dad did.
So did Catherine and Eleanor. I sent flowers, but I didn't write a card. What would I have said? "Thank you for teaching me everything I needed to unlearn"? Instead, I lit a candle in my apartment and sat in silence. Not in grief. Not in relief. Just silence. James moved in the following spring. We planted a garden together. Herbs, tomatoes, strawberries. I learned to cook without counting. To eat without guilt. Not every day, but most. That was enough. Sometimes, when the sun is setting and the kitchen smells like rosemary and lemon, I feel her ghost in the room. Watching, measuring, judging. I let her stay, but I don't let her speak. Because now, the only voice that matters is mine. And I finally learned how to use it. There's something haunting about an empty chair at a dinner table, especially when you know exactly who used to sit there and exactly how much control they held from it.
After Linda died, that chair haunted me.
Not literally, but symbolically. I'd see it in every client who flinched when asked about food history, in every teenage girl who recited calories from memory with military precision, in every mother who tracked her daughter's lunchboxes down to the last grape. The chair wasn't just Linda's anymore. It was every person who'd turned nourishment into a battlefield. And I had to do something about it. The success of my memoir opened doors I hadn't anticipated. Publishers called. Schools requested lectures. Nonprofit asked me to consult. At first, I accepted sparingly, choosing opportunities where I could speak freely, honestly. But as my name grew, so did my responsibility. I could no longer pretend my past was only mine. It had become a blueprint for others, those looking to survive their childhoods and those terrified they might be repeating history without meaning to. I didn't want to be a symbol, but I was becoming one anyway. James supported me in ways no one ever had. When I returned from long speaking trips exhausted and shaky, he ran baths and made warm soup from scratch. When I doubted myself, he reminded me of who I used to be and who I'd worked so hard not to become. Once, after a particularly grueling session with a mother who wept after realizing her healthy food rules had broken her daughter's spirit, I collapsed into James's arms and sobbed, "What if I'm just feeding the cycle by reminding people it exists?" He didn't answer right away, just held me until the shaking stopped. "You're not feeding the cycle," he said finally. "You're giving them the language to break it." With that clarity, I began forming what would become my greatest contribution to the field, the Reframe Initiative, a trauma-informed nutrition curriculum designed not just for professionals, but for families, teachers, caregivers, anyone tasked with feeding others. It focused on permission over restriction, trust over control. I poured every ounce of myself into it. Every journal entry from my childhood, every calorie count, every whispered fear. I turned them into chapters, case studies, teaching tools. If Linda had left me with nothing else, she'd left me with data. Still, I had blind spots. One of them was Eleanor. She reached out the year Emma turned 11, asking if we could meet. At first, I declined. But her next message was different. It contained no accusations, no guilt. Just one sentence. Emma says she doesn't like how her body is changing, and I don't know what to say that won't break her. That got my attention, because I remembered that age. Remembered hiding in the bathroom, watching my thighs touch, and wondering what I'd done wrong. I agreed to meet at a neutral cafe. Eleanor looked older, but softer somehow. She wore no makeup, and her hair was pulled back in a messy bun that reminded me of our mother in better times. We made small talk at first, whether work, school, but eventually she brought out a notebook. I've been documenting some of the things Emma says. You know, so I don't miss patterns. I took the notebook gently, skimming her entries. They were heartbreaking in their familiarity. I feel puffy after eating. I wish I had a flat stomach like the girls on Instagram. Maybe I'll skip dinner to make up for lunch. I nodded slowly, carefully, choosing my words. This is the age where it starts, where the war between appetite and acceptance begins. Eleanor's eyes welled with tears. How do I stop it?
You don't, I said.
But you can guide her through it. You can be the voice that says hunger isn't shameful, that bodies are not moral report cards, that food isn't a sin to confess. We talked for hours. About Emma, about us, about Linda. And for the first time, I saw that Eleanor hadn't just been a bystander. She'd been a child too, manipulated differently, but still shaped by the same hands. You were the favorite, I said at one point. She gave you everything I didn't have. I know, Eleanor replied. But I also gave it up when she asked. She used me to punish you, and I let her. I'm sorry. It wasn't absolution, but it was honesty. And in that moment, it was enough. After that meeting, Eleanor became one of my strongest allies. She helped pilot the Reframe Initiative in her school district. She spoke publicly about our family's legacy, her own blind spots, her efforts to parent differently. Together, we created workshops for parents and caregivers, training modules for teachers, even children's books that talked about food with kindness and curiosity. Emma thrived in that environment. She played soccer, wore crop tops without shame, ate ice cream without apology. One day, she texted me a picture of a rainbow bowl she'd made for lunch. Quinoa, chickpeas, cucumbers, strawberries. Balanced, colorful, and totally not counted, she wrote. I cried when I saw it. Not because of the food, but because of the freedom it represented. The final ghost to exorcise was Dad. We hadn't spoken much since he'd cut contact, but time had softened him. At first, it was just birthday cards. Then a voicemail on Christmas. Eventually, we agreed to meet at the botanical garden, neutral territory full of life. He looked older than I remembered. Grayer. Slower. But his eyes still held that familiar mix of gentleness and guilt. I failed you, he said, sitting on a bench near the koi pond. I let her hurt you. I didn't argue. I didn't soothe. I let the truth hang in the air, cold and sharp. Then I spoke.
You didn't see it.
But when you did, you didn't deny it. You took responsibility. That's more than most. We walked for hours that day.
No resolutions. No erasures.
Just two people trying to reconnect through the ruins. He never remarried after the second wife. Said he couldn't bear to risk it again. But he kept tabs on me, bought every book, watched every talk, donated quietly to eating disorder nonprofits. I'm proud of what you've done, he said as we parted. Not just for surviving, but for teaching others how. I went home that night and ate a full meal. Pasta, garlic bread, salad. I didn't measure the oil. Didn't skip dessert. I lit a candle on the table, not for Linda, not for grief, but for closure. The kind you write yourself when none is given. Because healing doesn't come in a straight line. It comes in spirals. In moments where you make the choice not to repeat the pattern. In meals eaten with joy instead of guilt. In voices, your own, your sister's, your niece's, speaking truth into rooms that once held silence. And the chair at the table? It's still there. But now, it holds no power. It's just wood and fabric and memory. A place no longer haunted. Even with all the healing I'd done, all the progress I'd helped others make, some nights still brought the ghost back. The one that looked like a girl with hollow cheeks and aching ribs, standing in front of a refrigerator she wasn't allowed to open. It would creep in while I brushed my teeth, whispering questions I thought I'd buried. What if you're still her? What if this is just control with better lighting? And I'd have to sit with that doubt, not run from it, not feed it, just recognize it. I'd learned not to make war with the hunger anymore, physical or emotional. Some cravings weren't about food at all. I was mentoring a new nutritionist at the time, a bright, empathetic young woman named Kiera. She'd survived her own complicated upbringing, and her passion for helping others was raw and unfiltered. One afternoon, while reviewing a patient file, she asked, "Do you ever feel like you're still in the room with your abuser, even when you're leading the session?" I looked at her for a long moment, then nodded. Sometimes I feel like I am the abuser in the room. That maybe I've just swapped tools. Back then, it was counting other people's food. Now, I write their plans with a smile. She looked horrified for a moment, but I waved her worry away. The difference is I know the weight of those decisions now. And I know how to ask why before I ask what. Why are you avoiding breakfast? Why do you feel safer hungry than full? Kiera taught me things too. She challenged my protocols, questioned my assumptions. When I once recommended removing trigger foods from a pantry, she countered, "What if instead of removing the food, we remove the shame?" I laughed aloud. "I wish someone had said that to me at 15. She replied, dead serious. "I wish someone had said that to Linda." And that was the truth I couldn't escape. Somewhere, in a world before me, Linda had been a hungry little girl too. Maybe not for food, but for control. Safety. Approval. Something she never got in the shape she needed. That didn't excuse what she became, but it explained a hunger that haunted us both. The Reframe initiative grew faster than I could have predicted. Within 2 years, we'd partnered with hospitals and schools across 3 countries. We translated materials into 5 languages. We trained doctors, therapists, school cafeteria workers. And yet, I couldn't shake the irony that it all began with a woman who once made me count green beans and hide cookies under my mattress. One night, Kiera called me after a particularly difficult client relapse. She was shaken. "I don't think I'm cut out for this," she said, her voice cracking. I told her it wasn't her fault, that recovery isn't linear. But I don't even believe that for myself sometimes. I let her cry, then said gently, "Kiera, you're going to sit across from hundreds of versions of your younger self. And sometimes you'll help. Sometimes you won't. But the fact that you're sitting there, that is what matters. You've already broken the cycle just by showing up." After we hung up, I found myself drawn to the old storage boxes I kept locked in the attic. Relics I'd never had the courage to part with. Among them, Linda's journals. The ones she wrote during my childhood. Pages upon pages of calorie tracking, punishment plans, fasting schedules disguised as corrections. My hands shook as I flipped through them. And then, something I'd never seen before, a loose photograph, tucked between pages. It was her, young, maybe 10 or 11, sitting at a table with a slice of birthday cake in front of her. Her face frozen between joy and panic. The caption on the back, in childlike handwriting, read, "Only one bite allowed. Don't get fat like mom." It hit me then. The origin. The infection point. Someone had done this to her, and she had passed it to me like a genetic curse. I set the photo aside and wept, not for her, not even for me, but for every girl made to fear her own appetite. A month later, I was invited to speak at a conference in New York on generational trauma in nutritional psychology. I opened with the photograph. I told the room of clinicians and caregivers about Linda, not in her monstrousness, but in her girlhood. I talked about inherited fear. I read excerpts from her journals alongside my own, the terrifying symmetry of them. I saw people crying. I saw people taking furious notes. I saw understanding begin. When I stepped off stage, a woman approached me. She was trembling. My mother did the same thing. I thought I was crazy for still hearing her voice when I eat. Thank you for showing me I'm not alone. I hugged her, and in that moment, I wasn't the expert or the speaker. I was just another survivor trying to make the next bite a little kinder. That night, I dined alone in the city, at a tiny Italian place, candlelight flickering. I ordered without guilt. Pasta with cream sauce, crusty bread, a glass of red wine, and the most decadent tiramisu I'd tasted in years. And as I ate, slowly, fully, I imagined Linda watching, not with anger, but with that terrified birthday girl face. I imagined her leaning forward, whispering, "Is it safe yet? Can I eat now?" And I whispered back, "Yes, you can. It's over now." But was it ever really over? That's the thing about recovery. It's not a finish line. It's a daily recommitment to compassion over control. It's answering the voice that says don't eat with one that says eat anyway, because you deserve to be nourished. Later, back home, James asked me how the conference had gone. I told him the truth. It was the first time I spoke for Linda, not against her. He nodded, squeezing my hand. Maybe that's the last part of healing. Telling the story so completely, it stops being a wound and starts being a map. And that's what I wanted my work to be from then on. Not a weapon, not a warning, but a map. For every girl taught to apologize for her hunger. For every boy praised for restraint, but never for joy. For every adult still haunted by dinner tables and bathroom scales. A map that said, you can go a different way. The seasons had turned 5 times since Linda's hospitalization when I received the letter. It came not through legal channels, not typed or stamped or signed by any official, but in shaky handwriting on aged stationery that smelled faintly of antiseptic and paper glue. The return address was the nursing home. No return name, just a trembled scrawl, for her. My hands paused over the envelope, my breath slowing. It wasn't curiosity that made me open it. It was obligation, a final thread in the frayed tapestry that bound us together, student to teacher, daughter to tormentor. Inside was a single page. At the top, a sentence so unlike her that I reread it 3 times to believe it was real. I was wrong. The words floated on the page, not followed by justification, not wrapped in denial, just raw and bare. I don't remember when it started, only that hunger made me feel powerful. Not just my own, but yours. And when you grew up strong enough to turn that hunger on me, I thought I'd be angry. But I wasn't. I was relieved. Because now you'd understand. And maybe understanding is the closest thing I'll get to forgiveness. She hadn't signed it. I don't know if she meant it. But it didn't matter anymore. I folded it back into the envelope and placed it in a drawer I no longer opened often. The drawer where I kept other truths too dangerous for daily light. That weekend, I stood outside the nursing home, unsure if I would go in. My name was still flagged on the restricted visitor list, but I'd made arrangements. I wanted to see her, not to punish, not to relive anything, just to witness her, the final chapter in a book I'd been writing since I could spell calorie. She looked small, impossibly so. Her body, once so sharp with control, had softened with age and disease. She didn't speak when she saw me, just looked at me with a quiet awareness, a kind of surrender. I sat beside her bed and said nothing for a long time. And then I pulled out a protein bar, unwrapped it slowly, and placed it on the tray. This one, I said gently, has exactly 210 calories. 15 grams of protein. But it also tastes like chocolate and rebellion. Her lips twitched, almost a smile. She didn't reach for it. She didn't need to. That wasn't the point. When I left, I didn't look back. Some exits don't require goodbyes. They require endings. In the years that followed, I devoted myself more deeply to advocacy work. Not just for patients recovering from eating disorders, but for caregivers, too, for the unseen daughters feeding their mothers while starving their own boundaries, for the sons spooning food into fathers who once demanded weight loss as a love language. I lectured about ethical caregiving, about how old abuse can become new harm when we don't interrogate our own pain. I built workshops with names like Feeding Without Fury and When Helping Hurts. I told my story over and over, letting it change shape each time, not to hide, but to reflect growth. With every telling, the edges softened. The rage eroded, leaving behind something closer to compassion, if not yet forgiveness. I was becoming not just a teacher, but a translator, converting suffering into understanding, converting old grief into new tools. One of my last talks was at a high school where a teacher had asked for a presentation on nutrition. I went beyond the food groups and pyramids. I talked about how food is love and punishment, comfort and control, celebration and fear, all depending on how we're taught. A girl in the front row raised her hand and said, "My mom hides candy and only gives it to me if I've been good. Is that normal?" I looked into her frightened eyes and said the words I needed so long ago. That's not your fault. You're not wrong to want sweetness. When I came home that night, James had made dinner. We sat quietly at the table, clinking forks, passing bowls. Our son, Milo, asked if he could have seconds, and I smiled and said, "Take what you need." It was a simple phrase, one I used with clients often. But that night, I felt the fullness of it, what it meant to allow others to be fed freely, without surveillance or shame. And more importantly, what it meant to finally allow myself. Years passed. The Reframe Initiative became a foundation, then a movement. I published a book, part memoir, part guide, called What We Feed Each Other. It reached people I never expected. Men who hid their eating disorders behind gym memberships. Grandmothers who'd counted points their whole lives and finally wanted to stop. Teachers who recognized warning signs in lunchrooms. Survivors who finally had a name for what had been done to them. Linda passed away in late autumn. A nurse called to inform me. There was no next of kin listed, she said, but your name was noted as her last visitor. I thanked her, hung up, and sat in silence. Not out of grief. Not even closure.
Just stillness.
I lit a candle. I wrote her name in my journal. And then, I went downstairs and made a meal that tasted like freedom. Warm bread, fresh butter, a bowl of lentils the color of earth and healing. I ate every bite. The last time I visited my childhood home, now empty, soon to be sold, I walked through each room not with bitterness, but with curiosity. The kitchen where I learned fear. The dining room where I learned silence. The bedroom where I hid food and dreams and tears. I took nothing with me. Not a spoon, not a curtain, not a chair. Only the memory. Only the lesson. And now I speak directly to you, the listener, the reader, the witness. If you've ever felt hunger that wasn't about food, if you've ever measured your worth in grams or guilt, know this. You are not alone. You are not broken. And the cycle can end with you. We are more than what we eat. We are what we choose to feed. Our bodies, yes, but also our hearts, our futures, our children, our stories. Thank you for walking with me through this. For listening, for feeling, for remembering. If this story moved you, if you saw a piece of yourself in it, or someone you love, please like, comment, and subscribe to Kindle Stories Official. Your support helps us share more stories of truth, transformation, and resilience. Until next time, take what you need and leave behind what no longer feeds you.